Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third lecture of Paraspar Reading the Past series organized by the Office of Communications, Indian Institute of Science. Today we have Dr. A.P. Ashwin Kumar, who will speak on In Defense of Ordinary Criticism. To begin the event today, I would like to first introduce the speaker. Dr. A.P. Ashwin Kumar is presently Senior Fellow, Center for Learning Futures, Ahmedabad University. He has over a decade of experience in teaching and research in cultural studies. He has worked in higher education, grant design, and policy review, alongside being a literary and academic translator. His research interests are primarily in philosophy of culture, cultural theory, and conceptual history. His work addresses questions related to the philosophical landscape of the issues involved in the study of human cultures. He has a PhD in cultural studies from Manipal University. Ashwin has worked at the Higher Education Cell at the Center for the Study of Culture and Society, Bangalore, where he was heading the Regional Language Resource Initiative involved in enhancing the use of Indian languages, resources in higher education. As well as the digital footprint of Indic languages. He was associated with Sir Ratan Tata Trust Mumbai as a consultant for their higher education portfolio. He has published widely. More recently, his book titled Nationalism, Language and Identity in India, Measures of Community was published by Routledge in 2019. He is the co-editor of a forthcoming book, The Difficulty of Being Heathen, Essays in De-Orientalizing India, to be published by Orient Black Swan. Ashwin, we are very happy to have you here today. May I now request you to please deliver your lecture?
Sure. Thank you, Vitasta. And thank you for an invitation from IISc Office of Communications, and any invitation from Bangalore is, although it's virtually being in Bangalore, I'm sure it means a lot to a erstwhile Bangalorean. Let me share my presentation so that all of us can have a quick track of what we're talking about. Right. Broadly speaking, today's talk is about ordinary experiences, ordinary criticisms. That is the kind of thing that you and I do as ordinary people going about our everyday life, which seems like a very bizarre thing if you look at it through a philosophical lens. The ordinary needs to be saved. The ordinary experience needs to be recuperated through a lot of theoretical work. It's a little bit like what happens in science. The school book science that you would have seen. It's an ordinary experience that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. But to recuperate this experience back, you need an entire complex theory of heliocentrism and all sorts of stuff. Otherwise, these things don't quite fit well. So the ordinary requires extraordinary effort to understand. The specific ordinary criticism that we are talking about today is the social criticism that we all engage in. We engage in it as citizens, in our everyday context, as philosophers, as social scientists, as policymakers, and stuff like that. I would want to propose that there are two ways, or a distinction can be made in the way we go about criticizing social forms, social phenomena. And that criticism I want to tag by giving some names to it. These are all constructions that I'm talking about, and in a way that I want to set up a theoretical structure to make sense of some arguments. So all of this is up for question and criticism. Think about an example, like the example that I talked about in that little write-up. Think about child marriage. I'm sure most of us in today's time and age would be against such a practice. Or let's put it this way, none of us would think of child marriage as something that you and I would commit or do or probably practice. We are not comfortable with it. We think it's a bad practice. But if I were to ask you, why do you think child marriage is a bad practice, then there may be a couple of answers. Let's say you will say something like, oh, it's not a good thing to do. Why would you want to get young people married? Let them live their life, figure out their experiences, and then slowly marry. Or you might want to say, there are some bad consequences to child marriage. There will be the question of neonatal health, the health of young mothers, the health of young infants at such born of young mothers, and all sorts of things. And the happiness that you need to encounter, the joy of living life before becoming a mother. All of these sorts of things would be reasons why we think child marriage is not a good idea. Supposing I were to further ask you, well, if for an argument's sake, I were to solve all these practical problems of child marriage that you have, health of young mothers, health of young infants born to young mothers, the freedom that young people need even before they get into marital relationships, and all sorts of practical problems that you talked about, all sorts of consequences of child marriage. Supposing I were to give you a system, or supposing I were to give you a solution where all of these things are taken care of, would you then be okay with child marriage? Our contemporary attitude to this would be to say, no. Even then, we are not okay with child marriage. Now I will have to ask you why. You will then have to slightly move from that first level of criticism, which I'm calling the ordinary criticism, of saying it's bad for the mother, it's bad for the child, and things like that. And you'll have to give me some other foundational principles. You'll have to tell me something like, each human being has a fundamental right for choice. Each human being has a fundamental right for self-determination, that is, determining their own life. Each human being has the right to autonomy. And child marriage is a practice which is in principle against these kinds of fundamental principles. And therefore, it's an irrational practice. Therefore, even if you were to solve all the pragmatic problems of something like child marriage, it is still an abhorrent practice. It is still a practice which we will need to reject. So you see, we do make these distinctions in our everyday goings about. We do make a distinction between ordinary criticism and foundational criticism. So the distinction that I'm putting out here is not purely a term of art. It is something that you and I both do. So it's a distinction which exists out there in the world if you search enough. But there are some consequences of this distinction. And the consequences are not always as obvious and clear to us as we think it is. So let me just talk a little more about the distinction itself. First, take ordinary criticism. Let's say if the undesirable consequences are mitigated, ordinary criticism can make peace with a distinction. A classical example is what happened in Karnataka a few years ago with this practice in one of these temples of a practice called Made Snana, where devotees rolled over the leftover food eaten by Brahmins and things like that. And some people had problems with it. And so how do you solve the thing? Well, you change the practice a little bit and say, okay, from now on, it's not leftover food, but leftovers of the offerings of the god or something like that. You change it a little bit and you can make peace with the practice, and the practice itself can continue. So what is the distinction here? The ordinary criticism that you're making about, oh, people rolling over leftover food is slightly not so good. Let's not have this practice. It is not beginning with a principle about why something is right or something is wrong. It is just beginning with an experience of undesirability. You just look at it and you feel a little uncomfortable with these kind of things, and you don't want to have these kind of practices, and that's it. This experience of undesirability that you have about some practice, say 100 years ago, nobody would have had a problem with people rolling over leftover food. Today, many of us may have that kind of a problem looking at people rolling over leftover food. So there's a historical conditioning to our response. It is not that it is obviously automatically horrible, but historically we have come to see this as sort of aberrant. But even if it's historically conditioned, it is not beholden to any specific principle. That is, our criticism of this, our ordinary criticism of this, is not coming from a principle. It is just coming from an experience of undesirability. We look at it and we feel uncomfortable. That's it. But a foundational criticism of the same practice is not at that level. It is at a slightly deeper level. It is not, first of all, about a consequence of a practice. Like I said, it's about the rational basis of that practice. So go back to the Madesnana example I gave you. The question here is not, why should you not have Madesnana? Or why, if everyone is feeling good about it, or if they think that's a good thing, let them do it. Why would you stop it? Well, the objection, the foundational criticism's objection, as you might yourself have given versions of this objection or seen versions of this objection, is that there is no rational basis for this practice. In fact, there is an irrational basis to this practice. Like with child marriage, so with Madesnana and any number of social practices that you see being criticized in and around, this irrational basis is what needs to be attacked. So it doesn't matter what tweaks you give to the practice. Fundamentally, it is irrational because it is based on foundational principles which are irrational. There is an irreconcilability between the values of people who accept Madesnana and the values of people who reject it, or the values of people who might have accepted child marriage a few years ago, a few decades ago, versus the values that you and I accept. So this irreconcilability cannot be overcome, which means with the help of foundational criticism, you can call for a blanket ban on a practice, which you can't do with ordinary criticism. And ordinary criticism will say, fine, this is very uncomfortable, but if you can change it a little bit here and there, that's fine, because that's exactly how it's happened in many cases. Practices are altered and traditions are altered, but it just continues, so we can come up with many examples, but I'll for the paucity of time, I'll just move on. I'll bring in other examples as we go along. So these are some of the consequences of making ordinary criticism, that it is difficult to call for a blanket ban on the practice because it's not based on principle, it is based on an experience of undesirability. If I remove that undesirability from the context, it's okay, we can live with this. What is there? Say, for instance, in a temple town in Karnataka, there used to be animal slaughter to the goddess. And I think sometime in the early 1900s, Mahatma Gandhi visited the place and he said, I will not come to the temple if there is animal slaughter. And from then on, people decided that they are going to now pull out some blood from the buffalo through an injection, through a syringe, and give that as an offering to the god. So it is still a blood offering of the buffalo to the goddess, but it is not as a result of sacrificing the goddess, but through a syringe or injection or something like that. But a foundational criticism would say, look, even then there is a problem here. The problem is in the nature of your relationship between sacrifice and the practice itself. It's an irrational practice. It doesn't matter whether you're butchering or taking it out by syringe, but there's a fundamental problem here that you need to look at. So also with ordinary criticism, because it is not grounded in principles, it cannot be exhaustive, it cannot be a final critique. So it has to be a very contingent, contextually variable criticism, which is the kind of criticism you and I make in our ordinary life every time we go around seeing things. So in some cases we say, oh, take the case of capital punishment, for instance. Most people, most ordinary responses to it would be case based. You would say, oh, this one you should like really have capital punishment. But this other case, maybe we don't need to have a capital punishment. We really don't work through the principles and derive the action, but we work through the cases and derive a judgment in our ordinary situation. But when we get into a foundational criticism, this is not an option. So here is one example of how the ordinary criticism works. You have heard this, right? You have heard many people in India and in many other places say this when you do something wrong. If I were to ask you, why should you not do this? The typical response that my grandmother or grandfather would give is, what would others think? Log kya kahenge? What about the others? Now, this seems to be the idea behind most of our moral behavior. What would others think? And most of us think this is a bad thing. Somehow, most of my modern friends feel this is not an adequate way of being moral. What is this way of being morally upright? Because of the fear of what others would think. You should be morally correct because you believe in those principles. If this is a hypocritical stance, to be good because you're afraid of other people. You should either give a utilitarian defense. If you're a philosopher of morals and ethics, you would say you should give a utilitarian defense saying that this is the principle I hold because this assures the maximum good of the maximum number of people. Or you should give a deontological defense, which is to say that this is the moral principle I hold because this is the most universal principle possible within this scheme of actions. So you should give one of these. Instead, most Indians or most ordinary people that you seem to know seem to be giving this reason, that what would others think? It's a very, very dishonorable way of being moral. Indians are either hypocritical or less moral than others, moral infants, or there must probably be some other way of understanding this thing. And here is what I have put in as some points to understand the what would others think paradigm better. When you're saying what would others think, obviously the focus is on others, which means on a public and shared repertoire of actions. That is, we all share a common repertoire of actions, a common pool of actions, which we understand. And that is the reference when you will have to say, you will have to judge something is right or wrong. You will also probably agree with me when I say that moral judgment is a learned disposition. It doesn't come from inside your belly or your heart or wherever. It is a learned disposition. You learn it by looking at your typical social forms, which means it's learned from your own social world. That also means that social world consisting of others is the ultimate court of appeal in adjudicating matters of propriety, in adjudicating matters of what is right and what is wrong. There are no principles, there are only examples. And that is the idea when someone is saying, what would others think? I mean, not that they're thinking through all these logical implications, but this is the world within which a what would others think kind of criticism makes sense. Which means the ordinary criticism of what would others think seems to have a certain depth, a certain richness, a certain contextual richness, which we need to dig a little deeper and figure out. It is saying that it is not simply saying something arbitrarily, randomly, but it is saying that the nature of a moral life is such that it is built through learnt dispositions. It is built through a shared repertoire of actions, a shared bunch of actions. And therefore, that shared inheritance of actions, what is called the social world, that should be where you will have to go to refer to whether something is right or wrong. You can't go to some principle before or beyond that. But you should be careful when I say this. When I say, just let me go back. I said these are learnt dispositions, that there is social learning involved in understanding what is it to be moral. Without this social learning, there is no meaning to saying that what would others think or being moral. But you should be careful about one tendency in social and moral and political thinking, philosophical thinking, which trivializes this, and that trivialized version is social constructivism. Social constructivism is something which says, what you think of as absolute givens are actually socially constructed. Yes, but beyond the point, it really fails to say anything significant. So you might have heard this hundreds of times in hundreds of contexts. Say for instance, gender is socially constructed, national feelings are socially constructed. Some people go on to say science is socially constructed, communities are socially constructed, religion is socially constructed. So pretty much everything, any social phenomenon you see is not something that is given, but it is socially constructed. So you don't need to take it as an absolute. That is not the emphasis that I am trying to bring about when I talk about social learning, about learning from shared action dispositions. My emphasis is slightly different. My emphasis is not to say that we are trying to explain what is the source of our moral judgments. I'm not saying the source of our moral judgments is social learning. Therefore, no, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if it is socially learned, it is an indication towards an appropriate moral orientation. That is, we are learning our goings about the world in a way that we also learn what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. The learning comes hardwired with standards of appropriateness and not appropriateness. And most often in our everyday life, actions are criticized because they don't seem to be appropriate by some day-to-day standards, some ordinarily available day-to-day standards. We don't criticize actions because they fail to match up to some logical chain of foundational principles. That is not why we criticize most things. So for instance, if someone is stealing things if children steal a pencil or something in a school and come back and say, I stole this, usually you don't criticize the children or anyone else for that matter, saying there is an absolute value to private property, and any breach of private property is a breach of common codes of community, and therefore what you're doing is wrong. We don't say that. We say something else. Oh, you should be ashamed of taking this thing from someone else. Is this the way you want to grow up? What if someone else steals what you're stealing? There are day-to-day standards by which actions are criticized, and they're not criticized because they don't follow or they don't fall into some foundational principles. The foundational principle story has some other thing to, some other role to perform. We'll look at it in a minute. And it is this aspect of social learning that I am trying to focus on when I say that moral judgment is socially learned. Here is an example I would want to give you. Before you start looking at this, let me give you a quick story. Austin and Hare, that's J.L. Austin and Richard Hare, are these two big-time moral philosophers of England during the interwar years. And this is a story that the Columbia philosopher Akil Bilgrami recounted. The story goes something like this. Hare was invited by Austin to give a lecture on moral philosophy. And Hare held forth on moral principles, which moral principle has to be preferred over which other moral principle, and so on and so forth, and why moral principles are absolute reference points, and how without principles you can't figure out what is right, what is wrong, etc. So it was a very successful lecture and all of that. And after the lecture, Austin was really angry because he was against this kind of thinking about morals. So Austin called Hare to a corner and said, Hare, here is my problem. Imagine A student of yours will give you will tell you that I'll give you $30, 30 pounds. Pass me in this examination. What will you do? Hare says to Austin, I will say, no, taking bribes are against my principle. Austin replied to Hare, it seems, saying, oh, is that so? I would have said no thanks. You see, what is the distinction? Austin is saying, as a professor, I wouldn't accept a bribe because it's a shameful thing to do. I would just say no thanks, and let it be. I wouldn't say I have a principle and taking a bribe is against the principle and therefore I'm not doing it. No, I'm deciding things in some other way, and your moral principle stock is very, very rude and rigid to understand the sensitivity and the subtlety of my decision of how to go about doing the right things. You will notice that most often, and this is a point I'll come back to again in greater detail in the next slide, most often when you're doing the right things, you're not doing it because you believe in a principle, but because you're ashamed of doing the wrong thing. That's not the thing to do, I mean, that's not how you should be. Let's come to that in a minute. But so this was what Austin was saying, that there are no ultimate moral principles. But you should be careful here, because there is a tendency these days especially of trying to make this point to mean something else very trivial. Moral judgments are not a matter of moral principles. What are they about? Well, social scientists will say they're about social conventions. Biologists, the neurobiologists will say, moral judgments are all about neural wiring. It seems there is some empathy in neurons. You look at someone else, the same thing happens to you. You feel like the same thing is happening to you that is happening to the other person. So there is some kind of neural stuff. There is some evolutionary traits of being good is good for the evolutionary traits of the species, so on and so forth. But all of these are in a way trivial. I mean, they may be true. I don't know if they're true or false, but irrespective of whether they're true or false, they may give you some conditions of how something like moral judgments would have developed in the species called human beings or in any other species. But they don't really tell you what kind of thing is this, what is happening when someone is making moral judgments. Therefore, even if they're true, they're trivially true. So we are better off keeping that aside and trying to look at what is Austin trying to say when he says to Hare that when someone gives me a 30-pound note and asks me to pass him in the exam, I would just say, no, thank you, I'm fine without that. Austin is saying I think Austin is saying that you should really reflect deeply on the very nature of learned dispositions. That is the moral of the story, not why we have moral judgments. Do we have it as a result of neural wiring or evolutionary traits or social conventions, etc.? And what is the nature of these learned dispositions? Well, these learned dispositions also have a hold on us. Exactly like the moral philosophers assume that absolute moral principles have a hold on us. In fact, these absolute principles may or may not have a hold on us, but our learned dispositions definitely have a hold on us. Only the hold is a different kind of a hold. That is, you will typically not steal. Most of us typically would not pick someone else's pocket. There might be about 1 or 2% people in the entire population who are pickpockets. You and I are not that. We would be very ashamed of ourselves if we end up picking someone's pockets. We would be really ashamed if we did something which we think of as absolutely a horrible thing to do. But why is that so? Not because we have an inferential chain of foundational principles well established in our brains, that we have thought through all of this and said, because of this higher level principle, this lower level principle can be derived, and because of this other principle can be derived, and therefore I'm not going to pick pockets in a bus or in an auto rickshaw. No, that is not how we're doing it. the hold that learnt dispositions have is in some other way. It is mediated through a network of other ordinary concepts. Like, you're ashamed of doing this. You're afraid of doing this. You think it's not an honorable thing to do. You don't need to do it. You will be unhappy if you do it, or you'll be uncomfortable doing this. So there are a range of other concepts, which are all ordinary concepts. Ordinary concepts as in concepts that you pick up from your everyday social learning, which reinforce each other in a networked manner, because of which you seem to these moral concepts seem to have a hold on us. It is not because of some principles that you can derive in some foundational way. And therefore, I've said that the network makes sense by reference to immediate instances of ordinary criticism. Now, something of this is captured in a Sanskrit term. I don't know if you have heard of this term. I'm sure it would have come up here and there if you have read some Indian literatures or older writings from the languages and all that. There's a concept in Sanskrit called a word in Sanskrit called Dharma Bhiru. A very good person, a virtuous person, is called a Dharma Bhiru. It's interesting to know what this actually means. Bhiru is a coward, someone who is afraid of something. That's a Bhiru. A Dharma Bhiru is a Dharma coward. I mean, if you were to literally translate it like a Google Translate, that is someone who fears ignominy. Now, this is the concept that exactly captures the kind of ordinary criticism idea that I'm trying to talk about. A morally upright person, if you were to use English words, typically will bring into your mind some idea of someone who has these lofty and high principles, someone who is moral because that person will never deviate from what is correct, what is true, what is virtuous, because they know the principles by which something is true, something is virtuous and correct, and so on and so forth. But the Sanskrit term for Dharma Bhiru seems to be giving a very different picture. It is saying the good person, the Dharma, the following person, is someone who is actually a Dharma coward. That is someone who is afraid of ignominy, someone who is afraid of what others will say, someone who will say, this is not the way of living. What about all of these other things? How can I do this? I can't do all of these kind of things. This is not like my way of doing it. This is what the Dharma Bhiru says. This is in stark contrast with our modern notions of virtue as a calling of the conscience. It's not that there's a voice of the God calling you from inside saying this is right and that is wrong, but there's a socially learned disposition of being a Dharma coward. This is virtue. Good virtue is when you are a Dharma coward. Now, it sounds very counterintuitive. Why would you want to call a coward as a virtuous person? Well, no, it's not any coward. It is a Dharma Bhiru who is a virtuous person. And that tells us something else, something more. And that is, these modern notions of conscience and moral principles and all of that, which are all actually foundational principles by which you hope to derive some moral values, are not the general cases. They are the special cases. The general case is the case of the ordinary notion of Dharma Bhiru. And why is that so? Because even for the foundational principles to operate, you should have the capacity to recognize virtues, typical examples of virtues and typical examples of vices. And that's only something you will get through ordinary learnt disposition. That is something you will only get by being a Dharma Bhiru. If you're not that, you will not learn it. So in fact, what we think of as philosophically deep and foundational are really special cases, peculiar cases, if you want, of the ordinary conceptions of what is the right thing to do. Let me move ahead a little bit. This might be slightly, it might sound a little complex to begin with, but stay with me. There is a deeper difference between ordinary criticism and foundational criticism. The deeper difference is something like this. The object of criticism in both of these are very different. let's assume you're still criticizing some bad practice. You're criticizing, or what you think of as a bad practice. You're criticizing child marriage. You're criticizing whatever be the practice, slavery, for instance. In ordinary criticism, usually the object of your criticism, that is what you're targeting your criticism to, is a specific practice or an action. Say, for instance, the great, grand, and much abhorred tradition of sati, where, and there's a huge literature on it, right? Where the woman was supposed to climb the pyre, the funeral pyre of the husband and all of that. In the ordinary criticism variety, there is a specific point of criticism. And what is that? The point of criticism is, why are you killing someone? Because their husband is dead. It's the practice that is being, that's the object of criticism. But the foundational criticism is not simply about the practice. That is not the object. The object is the structure of society itself. What is the social structure which will produce a practice like sati, child marriage, or something else, That is, these aberrant practices that you're seeing around you, child marriages and sati and slavery and whatever else, they are all actually consequences of a defective fundamental principle. That's the assumption of foundational criticism. So this defective fundamental principle is what you see in the structure of society, and that is what is being criticized when you're criticizing an action like sati or child marriage or slavery or any other modern day examples that you have, Made Snana, women not being allowed to Shabarimala temple, so on and so forth. It is not the specific practice, but the social structure which whose fundamentally defective principles are resulting in these specific practices. Here, let me propose a certain theoretical leap. The object of ordinary criticism, I said, is practice. The object of foundational criticism is society. So now you can see what is society. Society, I mean, looked at in this reverse engineered way, is a theoretical posit. Like, you have whatever in early 20th century physics, you had phlogistons and ether and all of these things that you posited to account for certain things, or epicycles to account for the movement of planets in the geocentric system and all of that. It's a theoretical posit necessary for a foundational criticism. If you don't want to do foundational criticism, you don't need a concept of society at all. In fact, something like society is not an experiential concept at all. You might say, what do you mean? What do you see around us? Isn't that society? Well, in some vague and baggy way, yes. What you mean by society is the world around you. But that is not how you use it, mind you. You don't look around the world and say, oh, let me go take a walk in society, or let's go meet society. Let's have some society. That's not how you use it. Most often, the deeper way in which you use society is when you say things like, our society is corrupt. Our society has become, underdeveloped, or our society has to develop. There is a certain foundational criticism angle within which a concept like society makes sense. Outside of it, the word society is simply a word for anything, some vague reference to the outside world. It is really not a concept, not a thing. There is no thing called society unless you are operating within a foundational criticism structure. You will notice that in ordinary criticism, in our everyday ordinary goings about the world, you don't need, and therefore you don't have a conception called society, a concept called society. At the most, you will say, what will people say? Log kya kahenge? You may want to call it society, but it has no conceptual depth. The word society, its conceptual depth actually comes from it being part of a foundational criticism. Now, there is a bit of a historical detour one could take to make this point. The notion, it comes from a deeply Protestant notion that the corruption that you see in our institutions around us is a result. I mean, this was a Protestant critique of Catholicism. The corruption that you see is actually a result of the compromise of the fundamental principles of theology, or the fundamental principles of Christian dogma. And therefore, reforming reforming these corrupt practices is to go back to the correct foundational principles as against the faulty foundational principles. And this structure happens within the ecclesiastical world, the church world, as it were. The secular version of it is society, and the secular version of Protestant criticism of Catholicism is modern day social ideologies, social and political ideologies. That's a longer trajectory that one needs to be able to build. I will not build that here. I'll just hint to that connection and move on. Let me talk about a couple of other things, and probably stop at that and hope to get some questions and all of that later. Now, I said foundational criticisms are systemic explanations. By foundational criticism, I meant criticism which says things like child marriage is bad because it compromises on the fundamental autonomy of people. Women not being allowed in the temple is bad because there is a fundamental equality across all human beings because they share a common human essence, so on and so forth. These are all systemic explanations for why something is wrong and why something is right. But you might object and say, what's your problem with systemic explanations? Even natural sciences have systemic explanations. Natural sciences are systemic explanations. In fact, they're some of the best examples of systemic explanations. And if you're attempting to make systemic explanations out of foundational criticisms, there shouldn't be any great problem. What do we mean by systemic? I've just given a workaday explanation. You don't need to stick to that particular definition or anything. It's just for us to understand it. That you can explain specific phenomena as possibilities of the interrelationship between the elements of a whole. So sati, the practice of sati is wrong, not simply because sati is wrong, but there are so many other things which it connects to. Sati is connected to your attitudes about gender, that is connected to your economic relationships, that is connected to something else, and that is connected to, so the whole society has a certain structure, certain fundamental foundational structure, which can explain why a specific practice in this system works in the way that it works. Which is also true for natural sciences in a way of speaking. That is, why do things fall, or why is there a half-life of radioactive elements in this way or that way? Well, there are systemic explanations. The systemic explanation says these are the properties which define half-life, those are the elements which have these properties, and so on and so forth. And so there's a systematicity of explanations. It might seem like the modern social scientific and ideological intellectual attempt at providing foundational criticism of society is somewhat similar to the natural sciences providing explanations of physical phenomena. So both are, if one is good, the other is also good. If one is scientific, the other is also scientific. If one is systemic, the other is also systemic. That's how it appears. But there is a difference. There is a problem, or there's a crucial difference to be seen, to be shown, between the way natural sciences understands system, which I'm claiming is a valid way of understanding system, and these our social ideologies understand a notion of a system, which I'm claiming is probably an invalid way of understanding systems. Let's see what is that difference. Here is what a scientific explanation is, and a scientific explanation's understanding of a system is. A systemic explanation is a manner of arranging empirical experiences into a coherent whole. Okay, I'm not saying anything deep and profound. I'm just saying something very, very ordinary and obvious, and I want to stick to that ordinary level and make some distinctions at that level itself. So let's say any number of things. Some things break, some things don't break when you throw them, and some things spill and some things don't spill. You know, there are all sorts of empirical experiences you have. You can bring all of these into a systematic, coherent whole by talking about strength of material, brittleness, state of matter, and whatever your explanations are. A physical theory of things, you can bring them together and explain why certain things are brittle, certain things are not brittle, certain things are malleable, certain things are not malleable, certain things are resistant, certain things are conductive, so on and so forth. So it brings your empirical experiences into a coherent whole. It also involves selecting experiences, ignoring some others, positing unknown quantities when required, and so on and so forth. I mean, anybody who has read even like a school book introduction to modern day physics or biology will know all of this, right? That sometimes you ignore some things, you select something, you posit unknown quantities, like say, for instance, until recently, electrons were unknown quantities. Neptune was an unknown quantity, which was posited first and discovered later, and any number of examples. But what's important for us is that the experience itself is dealt with as a given. Now, science protects our experience by treating it as a given. By given, I don't mean a brute fact, an essential core, that which is true before everything else. No, none of those metaphysical stuff you need to take into consideration. By given, I mean a very ordinary conception, which is that which is at hand. That is, you look around, you see this. You look around, glass breaks. You look around, it is difficult to break a piece of rock compared to breaking glass. This is an ordinary conception. This is neither a brute fact, nor an essential core, nor a fundamental structure of reality. Nothing of that sort. It's just an ordinary conception. So science has a commitment or a sensitivity, let's say, not even commitment, a sensitivity to the experience as a given. This is the scientific explanations understanding, or the science's understanding of what a system is. When scientific explanations are positing systems, when scientific explanations are talking about systems, this is what they're talking about. Most importantly, they're talking about arranging experiences, not interpreting them. And they're talking about arranging as in arranging into a coherent whole, systematic whole, not interpreting. And they're treating experience as a given. In contrast, foundational criticism treats this very differently. So in foundational criticism, experience is treated as a symptom of the system. It is not a given, but a reflection of an antecedent principle, a concept that defines the system. What do I mean by that? Let's say there is some preference for child marriage in a community. It is not treated as a given. People here have a preference for child marriage. This experience is seen as a symptom of an inherently patriarchal system. Now, whatever else be our understanding of child marriage, you like it, you don't like it, all of that is a separate issue. But the fact that an experience is seen as a symptom of a concept is what I want us to focus on. Whatever else is the situation, you will agree with me that this is a devaluation of experience. It's a devaluation of experience because now experience is not treated as a given. It is treated as a reflection of a principle. That is, your experience is not a given, but it is what is coming about as a result of a foundational principle which even you may not know. So your experience of going about the world and making some distinctions about people and positions and places and hierarchies and whatever else you find in the social world is not simply your experience through learning. It is a reflection of a deeper principle. To that extent, experience is devalued. Experience is diluted in the foundational criticism mechanism. But both in science and our everyday going about the world, in our ordinary life, both science and ordinary life has this special thing that experience has a genetic role. That is, it is through your experience that new concepts and schemas are formed. It is through your experience or reflecting on your experience or organizing your experience, bringing them together, that new theories are built, new knowledge is gained, old knowledge is given away and new knowledges are developed. All of this happens with experience. That is, experience seems to have a genetic role, a role which brings forth new concepts and schemas and explanations and knowledge and understanding. But in the foundational criticism variety, experience doesn't have that role. Experience is the object that needs explanation now. Experience is a symptom of the system which now needs to be addressed. So this devaluation of experience, devaluation of experience, is at the heart, is at the core of my complaint with foundational criticism that I have been trying to mount in developing this talk. And therefore, it is something that produces violence. If experience is devalued, then that's a necessarily violent step. I'll not push that point too much now. If there are questions, we can pick that up. I'll just give you two examples of where this becomes very important. One example is the famous problem of the Gandhi scholars in this country. Most of you might have known about this, right? Gandhi was against untouchability. And Gandhi always defended some variety of varnashram dharma. And people have been torn in this contradiction. They have tried to make sense of Gandhi. Some of them have said, look at this. This shows Gandhi is either a hypocritical thinker or a very, very inconsistent thinker. How can you be against untouchability and supportive of varnashram dharma? Some people have tried to reinterpret Gandhi, saying, you know what, for Gandhi, varnashram dharma meant something else and untouchability meant something else, and so on and so forth, and whatever. Whatever you do, it seems like there's a problem. But there's a way of making complete sense of what Gandhi was trying to say. It is a simple point that if you go around your social world, there are certain experiences of unease. There are certain experiences of undesirability. Untouchability is one of them. You don't need any big systematic foundational critique or theory to locate the experience of unease with something like untouchability. Therefore, an ordinary criticism is more than enough to say that untouchability is wrong in today's time and age. It might have been practiced in some time, or it might not have been practiced, or whatever, but today I feel there is no place for it. There's no place for making caste-based distinctions in a restaurant, for instance. Nothing else is needed to make a criticism of this practice. But if you want to approach it not through an ordinary criticism lens, but a foundational criticism lens, you will have to now, the burden is on you to say, what is the foundational principle underlying this system? there must be some foundational principle. Now, the moment you start looking for these foundational principles, of course, you will find one or the other answer. You will find the caste system, you will find something else, you will find hierarchies, you will probably find, I mean, some biologists may want to go and say, no, this kind of hierarchization is biologically hardwired. Some sociologists may want to go and say, no, there is a particular way by which Indian society has developed because of which it has arrived here and there and so on and so forth. But whatever you do, all of this is leading us more and more towards a foundational criticism domain. Irrespective of the merit or demerit of these specific explanations, one thing is for sure, that a foundational criticism, even of these instances, is diluting or devaluing our experience. The only thing Gandhi was trying to do, like all Indian intellectuals of the traditional variety, was protect experience, do not devalue experience. And therefore, the only experience I need to now protect here is my sense of unease, my sense of discomfort with a practice that I don't like. I don't need to bring in a foundational criticism. So I think the way of reading Gandhi in this particular instance is to say that Gandhi was doing ordinary criticism and resisting foundational criticism, because foundational criticism leads to violence in a way that ordinary criticism does not lead to violence. Now, the violence component I will not develop further because it needs some more work. But just to go back a step, we began talking about the system and how science treats system and how foundational criticism treats the system. And I said this in science and in ordinary life, experience is seen as a given, whereas in foundational criticism, experience is not seen as a given, but as a symptom. I'll give you one other example from a completely different domain and stop there. This example might, at the face of it, appear like not connected with everything else we're talking about, but later on, you will see what the connection is. Take the instance of dream analysis. There are two traditions, psychoanalysis and Vedanta, which do dream analysis. Whereas psychoanalysis is a foundational conception, Vedanta has an ordinary conception of what is it to talk about dreams. Now, with a little psychoanalysis that you might have known, I mean, even if you have not known it, you will know enough of these 2 points, which is that a dream in psychoanalysis is seen as a deeper symptom of a deeper system of psychological repressions. That is, your dreams are actually some things which refer to some more foundational structure in your psyche. There is a repressive structure of the psyche, which is the system, and the dream is a symptom of that system. So there is a certain foundational conception, a certain structure which is systemic and deep and foundational when psychoanalysis is talking about dreams. Vedanta, on the other hand, has an ordinary conception of dreams. What does it do? Take, for instance, an example, a typical example that psychoanalysts would always talk about. Let's say you have a dream of incest, that you have some sort of illegitimate desire for your parent or your sibling or something like that. Psychoanalysis would interpret this dream to say, what is the specific psychic repression that this dream is trying to bring forth? You know, talk about Oedipus complex and Electra complex and whatnot and so on and so forth. A similar dream, a typical Vedantin would argue, shows something else altogether. What does it say? It says, look, in your everyday life, you don't have these desires. In your dream state, you seem to have these dreams. You seem to have dreams of incest with your parents or siblings or whatever. What does it show? It shows that these two planes, the plane of wakefulness and the plane of dreams, are exclusive. They're non-interpenetrable. Even if there is the same images and items in them, they are not interoperable, if you want. They're actually two different planes. Why is that important? Well, going further, the Vedanta experience says you will have to now see your experience as actually divided across three non-interpenetrable planes. There is a wakeful plane, there is a dream plane, there is a sleep plane. And these three, they might share the same items in them, but they are completely interpenetrable, non-interpenetrable. That is, what is true here is not true here, is not true there. You might be a rich man in your wakeful life, but when you're asleep, you don't know that. That's a completely different thing. You might be a rich man in your dream, but when you wake up, you're a beggar. But what you experience in your wakeful state and what you experience in your dream state don't penetrate, don't interpenetrate. What does that show? That shows that the experiencer cannot be equated at any one of these three planes. You cannot equate yourself with the wakefulness or the dream or the sleep plane because they're non-interpenetrable. And then it goes on to talk about what is the structure of this experiencer, what is the nature of this experiencer who cannot be equated with one of these three steps. Now, I don't know whether you want to agree with this theory or not, or whether you think this is a good theory or not. Those are separate issues. But what I want you to appreciate is how Vedanta protects the ordinary structure of our experience, does not give you a foundational conception, but instead simply creates a logical way by which different aspects of the experience can be brought together in a cohesive whole, in a way that, you know, natural sciences, ordinary experience, all of these do day in and day out. I'm not claiming any scientific value for one or the other. I'm just saying there is a similarity in the way ordinary conceptions are operating across different planes. Whereas there is a similarity in the way foundational conceptions are operating in different domains and disciplines. So there is, not just in social criticism, but across the board, these two ways of understanding experience, two ways of understanding systems, two ways of explaining, two ways of understanding, which can be talked about as foundational versus ordinary. To go back to my initial point, you will have to now see, after all of this, which of these two is a more wholesome and appropriate to our experience variety of criticism. Is it the ordinary one or is it the foundational one? I have weighed my bets on the ordinary one, and I have said there is great merit in pursuing the ordinary style. More importantly, there is great merit in avoiding foundational criticism. There is great merit in being suspicious of foundational criticism. But I would now request you to see whether you would want to weigh the scale slightly differently and come up with questions, observations, criticisms, and comments. Thanks a lot for this. Before I finish, I would want to make a small note here. This entire work, the theoretical structure of this work was developed in collaboration with a colleague of mine, Elizabeth Thomas, who is a doctoral student at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. The empirical stuff is something that I have developed independently. So, yeah, that's that. And thanks a lot. Over to you.
Thank you, Ashwin, for explaining some concept which I myself were struggling to, understand. We'll take some questions. Whoever has a question can type in the chat box and I can read it out, or you can yourself ask the question by unmuting yourself.
So finally, what you want to conclude, sir?
That you should always resist foundational explanations, which is what most of us would want to get into the moment you talk about social phenomena, and you should stick to, as far as possible, ordinary criticism. Without your knowledge, you would be doing foundational criticism of social practices most often. You should resist that. That is the conclusion.
That is correct, sir. What is it? See, when my wife is criticizing, I'll get angry. Can I can't? That you tell me for solution for at least that one.
Yeah. With your wife, you shouldn't get angry at all because foundational or non-foundational, you should just ensure that.
That's correct, sir. I'll agree. When I am in 25, I'll get angry. But now I'm in 50, I won't get angry. I'll be laughing. But when I'm 25, when people are 25, and wife criticize, how to control that?
Yes. No, that's a very useful lesson to learn.
Yes.
Ashwin, I have a naive question. I want to listen to your comments on when there is a conflict between foundational and ordinary criticism. Suppose in the context you have given, I understood the context where you explain sati or child marriage, but when there's a conflict in this two, how would one go about understanding it? I mean,
so most often there will be a conflict. In fact, say for instance, take the case of the Sabrimala temple conflict recently. The foundational criticism says this is gender injustice. An ordinary perspective would say this is the tradition. Now the question is, you could always weigh one thing over the other, but the real thing to do is to ask, where is this foundational criticism coming from? What kind of assumptions are being made to mount the foundational criticism? Right now, the problem is we don't seem to have a way of handling foundational criticism at all. It seems like the moment someone makes a principled point like this, the debate is already skewed. I'm saying, let's at least begin by asking some questions to the foundational criticism. Right now, we are not asking questions to foundational criticism. We are just like in a fighting mode, in a might is right mode. I make my point as a traditionalist, you make your point as a foundationalist, and we are not going anywhere forward. Instead, there is a way of examining foundational criticism for where it is coming from. And when you start examining it, you will see that its conceptual foundations are not as strong as it claims to be. So the question is not about choosing which one. The question is about being able to examine foundational criticism itself.
Also, one leading question: when you try to differentiate between foundational and ordinary criticism, are you leading to something like a theory versus experience kind of argument?
No, I'm not, because I'm saying that, say for instance, scientific explanations work with an ordinary notion of experience. So experience and theory go together. Foundational criticism and symptomatic understanding go together. So until now, we thought the distinction was between experience and theory. No, the distinction is not between experience and theory. It's not like this. It's like this. It is between foundational thinking and scientific thinking and ordinary thinking on the one side, and foundational thinking on the other.
Okay. Does anyone have any question?
Okay, maybe.
Hello.
Yeah, we can hear you.
It's not really a question, but maybe a comment-like thing. Just on the follow-up discussion you had regarding where this foundational criticism is coming from. Well, I think this foundational criticism partly comes from this, ordinary criticism actually. So, I mean, I understand that you are trying to get into deeper about where this foundational criticism comes from. But I think that if you go a little bit deeper, I think it somewhat relates or comes from the ordinary criticism itself, partly. So that is one thing I would like to comment. Another thing is, Other thing is, the person, choosing between foundational or ordinary is moderated by his, tendency to follow moral values. And this behavior, I mean, from my experience, real world experience, is a random phenomenon which is inherent to a person actually. So a person may be born with more moral principle following or less moral following. For example, if you take the example which you quoted about, picking pockets. I mean, you said only 1 or 2 people, probably 1,000 people or like that would like picking pockets. But I don't think like that. I mean, there are significant people, when they're left alone, they think that picking pocket is not a right thing if the conditions permit them. So this moral, of course, depending on whether it's, the foundational or ordinary, is moderated by a person's inherent nature to follow moral rules. And that can be scientifically explained from my experience.
Sure.
So
I think there's some merit in both your points, especially the first one. I think is an important point. That is, the foundational principle is actually parasitic on the ordinary criticism itself, but it is a distorted version. So although it originates in ordinary criticism, it distorts our understanding of the ordinary criticism. So what you're saying, I'd want to generally agree and add this little gloss. The second point you made is a little more complex. I don't know how exactly to put it, but let's see if one can say something about it in this following way. If supposing we did not know what the consequences of our behaviors are, how would people react to what we are doing? It is very difficult to develop the right moral orientation. That is, the moral sense that you think each one of us have more or less has to be learnt. And if you allow that they are learnt dispositions, then I think we are fine. We are saying that some of them, for whatever conditions, have learnt it in one way or not learnt it in another way. But the important fact is that they're learnt dispositions. And therefore, you're not choosing between foundational or ordinary criticism. That's not the distinction. All of us do ordinary criticism in our everyday life. There is a special ideological discourse that we learn once we get into these modern explanatory regimes, where we pick up this foundational criticism, although we don't understand it. We don't understand it, but we pick it up, and that is why it is distortive of experience. So I think there's something to be pushed there further on the lines that you've been talking about. But I think I'm generally in agreement, especially with the first point that you made. Thanks for that point.
Yeah, I mean, I know these are a little bit deeper points.
Yeah.
But it's just that I want to see how you technical people in the domain actually think about these things. Well, I am a technical background.
Yeah, right.
Right. So, but how I want to see, because I am telling from my experience, my real world experience.
Sure.
And I would like to see how your researchers in that field think about these deeper issues.
Sure.
So
anyway,
so that's the thing. Whatever.
Yeah. So
thank you.
I was wondering whether there's someone else who wanted to say something. I don't know.
Does anyone have any question? Yeah. So I think there are no more questions or comments.
Sure.
Thank you, Ashwin. It's been highly enriching to listen to you. And we look forward to your new book.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Ashwin.
Thanks a lot for that.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for this. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.